process perform qualitative risk analysis. In a risk analysis, we follow the step of identification, assessment, and then response. This process and the next process is all about assessment. We want to assess the rating of that particular risk, because while we are identifying risk, we may end up with a long list of the risk, and before we act on them, we need to do some level of ordering. And these processes perform qualitative risk analysis and perform quantitative risk analysis helps us in ranking risk on the basis of their probability and impact. So let's look at this particular process. Now from our previous process, what we got is a list of risks in the form of risk register. Now these risks need to be assessed. Now we can do an assessment on the basis of likelihood of this risk. Now likelihood can be assessed by a way of probability. It tells us how likely this risk is about to happen. And once we know the likelihood, we also need to look at a possible impact this risk can make. Now this impact can be at various dimensions. It could be a time impact, it could be cost impact, customer satisfaction impact, quality impact, etc. Now, how do we do the assessment of probability and impact? We can look at our organization process assets, historical data. We can put a judgment. We can conduct meetings and interview with the various stakeholders and identify a possibility of happening this event in the real life. We can also look at a scope statement. And once we know that yes, this risk is most likely to happen, how do we give a number to it? How do we get a rank to it? That is defined in our risk management plan. So with the help of all these, by doing our analysis, we identify how probable these given risks are and what kind of impact they can make on various project dimensions. Now once we do that analysis, we need to look at the overall risk rating. Now in order to identify a risk rating, we need to put factors of probability and impact and find out a common rating or a ranking which can tell us that which are the risks which are of higher priority. Now in order to create or identify this risk rating, we can use probability and impact matrix. What is it? A matrix where we have a probability at one dimension ranging from 0 to 1 and impact as another dimension. So here we take low to high and high to low. So here we are taking this side we are taking for negative risk, this side we are taking for positive risk. So the number which will come here would be something where probability is also high and impact is also high. Now what I am doing, I am trying to identify a factor by multiplying or by weighted multiplying the probability and impact. So let us take an example. For example, I have a risk. I says that if vendor delays his delivery for a given deliverable, my end deliverable or my end output will get impacted. So this is a risk. A delay from a vendor impacting your final deliverable. Now this risk you can give a probability on the basis of historical history of that particular vendor, how well he have been performing in the previous projects, or how well he is executing the project. So on that basis, you can identify how probable this particular risk is. Then we need to identify, if that happens, what kind of timeline or a cost impact it can make on our project. Now, along with this risk, we may have another risk. For example, that risk could be that if we do not get a given test environment, we won't be able to execute our regression testing. Now, these two risks need to be ranked. Which one is of a higher priority and which one is a lower priority. So we may give a number, say for example, the first risk one has a probability of 0.8 and impact of 0.8, it generates a number. If I am using direct multiplication, 1.6, 0.16, and the risk 2 may have a probability of 0.5, the regression test environment, and impact of also 0.5, it may generate 0.25. Now this one is not 0.16, this is 0.64. So now we have one risk talking about 0.64 and another risk is 0.25. It shows that this is of a high priority and this is relatively lower than this. Now this priority is not only driven by probability but factor of probability and impact. So in our risk management plan, we can have a risk probability and impact matrix which can tell us when should we consider risk high, at what particular number. If we get at that particular number, which is also called risk exposure, after that a threshold, what is my threshold, my organization threshold. So we identify that threshold, and risk beyond that threshold we categorize them high. Then we can also have a risk threshold for low risk, and rest may remain at a medium. So risk rating or a probability and impact matrix helps us in driving a rating or a ranking for a given risk. Now once we get it, then the fourth step we need to do is we need to identify a quality of data. We have been doing analysis on the basis of various expert opinion, reviewing historical information. Now we look back and see, are we doing the right analysis? Is the number which we are using has some basis or the background? So we do another technique which says risk data quality assessment. So we can say a risk data quality assessment. If we find the data is not good, then we may go back and perform this cycle again. If we find this is of good quality, then we may also apply another technique on it, which is risk urgency assessment. Now risk urgency is a third dimension. Here we were talking about two dimensions where probability and impact. The urgency is saying in a time frame how urgent this risk is, how soon the impact is going to happen on our project. Sometimes this risk urgency assessment may also get clubbed in impact. Means while giving a risk rating or a risk ranking, we pick this particular urgency assessment factor along. Now at the end of doing all this, we should update our risk register and other project document like assumptions and other logs with the outcome of this process. Now while doing all this, we always use expert judgment. And while performing these analysis, we also try to categorize risk register. So we do a risk categorization. So that the final outcome, the risk register, can give us more informative information, like it becomes, we can categorize on the basis of possible causes. For example, the risk 1 which was related to vendor, we can say a vendor or a third party impacted risk. Risk 2 which was more related to an infrastructure availability, we can categorize it infrastructure availability category risk. Sometimes risk category may come from a risk breakdown structure. While identifying risk, we may be already knowing some of the risk categories, but during this process, since we are doing more probability and impact analysis and giving it a ranking, we may identify new categories for the given risks. So now let us look at the input output. We have covered the process completely, but just to summarize, let us see what kind of input, outputs and tool and techniques are defined for perform qualitative risk analysis. So we have an input called risk management plan. Why do we use it? Because the rank, the number which we give to a given risk should be defined here. Many people in a given projects are identifying risk, so they should have some common framework to tell a number or rank a number against a possibility of that risk. So that is defined here. Categories are also defined here. The process of identifying risk and probability impact matrix is also defined here. We need to use scope baseline. Why do we need it? It helps us in identifying impact primarily. And then risk register, this which was a primary input for it, because primary input as well as primary output, we pick information from here and we update it after doing all these analysis here itself. And then we use enterprise environmental factor and organization process assets. Both helps us in giving probability, impact and urgency assessment of a given risk. Tools and techniques, probability and impact assessment. So we do a risk probability and impact assessment of first tool and technique. The second tool and technique which we use is probability and this one. Third tool and technique which we use is risk data quality assessment. Fourth tool and technique we use is risk urgency assessment. Fifth tool and technique which we use is expert judgment. Sixth tool and technique which can use is risk categorization. And output, we update project documents, which is primarily updating a risk register. So this was our first risk assessment process. This helps us in assessing and giving a ranking to a risk registers.